At this time, I would like to introduce Margaret Boonstra, who will be introducing our speaker and our presentation for today. Thank you.
Well, as I said a few minutes ago, I've been looking forward to this lecture, or these lectures, I should say, for about 3 decades. These are wonderful authors and political figures from Latin America who just became world famous in the last century. And I think a lot of us have heard the names of their books. Many have read them, even if they are not Spanish speakers or Latin lovers like I am. But none of us understand a great deal about this phenomenon that they're coming of age. And happily, this fall, or last summer, I should say, a mutual friend told me about a young woman who had moved to Gainesville, whose specialty was all these authors. And I said, oh, wow. So I called Patricia, and by golly, she said, yes, she would put together these 3 lectures. So I am so excited. I think I just love the title of your first one. What's love got to do with it? I thought that was only Tina Turner's words, but we've got them connected with these fellows. I have to tell you a funny story too. I have a very special interest in Octavio Paz. My husband was the Deputy Chief of Mission of the American Embassy in Mexico City in 63 to 66, 67. And Octavio Paz was very prominent in those days. And so was his wife, Elena Garros. And they were both in a circle there that my husband was fortunate to join once in a while, because he was dating the daughter of Diego Rivera. It was a very cultural, artistic, literary group. Well, Lee Harvey Oswald also was in that group several times, not with my husband, but he was with the others. And so Octavio Paz and his wife were interviewed for the Warren Report, and his wife extensively. And so I've always been, I never met either one of them, but my husband certainly did. And I've always been curious about them in particular. But all of these people you're going to talk about today got mixed up in their country's politics, that's for sure. So we will, I will stop talking, and I'll leave it to Patricia to tell us about the involvements of all of them.
Oh,
So welcome, Patricia.
okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to share screens and start off with a little technology. Forgive me, I am not like, even though Margaret called me a young woman, I am still struggling with technology. And I do want to thank you very much, Margaret, for that warm welcome. And I wasn't sure you were going to give me an introduction, so I'm going to take just a few seconds. I promise not to talk too much about myself, but I come to you from Madison, Wisconsin. I obtained my degree at the university there. I'm a Latin Americanist. In other words, I was trained to be a generalist, but I focused on, when I wrote that big book report called the dissertation, I focused on the essay in Puerto Rico. And why, I just want to give you a little background on that. Why I did that is because I was born in Mexico. My parents, however, are from North Carolina and Tennessee, so that's another story. I won't bore you with that one. But I was born in Mexico, raised in Puerto Rico, and then when I went to college, I flew off to to North Carolina and got educated, got my undergraduate degree there. But then at a later date, after having had a couple of professions, I worked as a journalist for about 6 or 7 years. And then I worked as a public relations person in San Francisco. And then I think I might have had a midlife crisis and decided that I wanted to be a university professor. So later in life, I became a Latin Americanist, and that's what I'm really excited to be able to share the little that I know about Latin American literature with you today. It's really a great pleasure to be here. Okay, so just a little. I want to give you some ideas as to how I broke down this huge Leviathan topic, Latin American literature in the 20th century. I picked a few superstars. Now, when I picked the superstars, the criteria was very arbitrary because I decided to go with the ones who had won the Nobel Prize for Literature and the canon. However, I just want to let you know that there are so many more writers out there that could be easily featured, almost as easily as the ones that we'll be talking about today. For instance, Margaret mentioned Octavio Paz's wife, Elena Garros. She was a writer in her own right, and a good one. But I'm sorry, Elena, I'm not going to talk about you today. I'm going to talk about your husband, Octavio. So another little reminder, just we have some upcoming classes, which we'll talk about novelists, Gabriel Garcia Marquez from Colombia, Mario Vargas Llosa from Peru. And then we finish the 3-part session with talking about some writers that are unforgettable in the 20th century. And they are Julio Cortázar and Jorge Luis Borges, both of them from Argentina. Today, however, we're going to talk about 2 poets and an essayist. However, Octavio Paz was also a poet, but we're going to focus on his most well-known essay. So the first one is the first poet is Gabriela Mistral. The second one is Pablo Neruda. And finally, Octavio Paz. Gabriela Mistral, Pablo Neruda are both from Chile, and Octavio Paz is from Mexico. So I decided to try to ask a thematic question, try to tie it together with an idea, which is what that catchy little title was all about. And the question is, what's love got to do with it? So not only am I going to talk about the biography, a little biographical information about these writers, and their literary contributions, but also try to address this question about what's love got to do with it. In other words, do they write about love? What are they, and how do they write about love, if they do at all? So we're going to talk about romance, loneliness, and yes, even onions. A little bit of geography and terminology briefly. I use the words Latin America and Spanish America interchangeably because Latin America, because the primary languages in this huge swath of land, of territory that is considered Latin America, there are Romance languages, which are Spanish, Portuguese, and French. And also there is a wide variety of indigenous languages that we can't forget. But so Latin America includes Mexico, Central America, the Caribbean, and all of South America. Again, as I was mentioning, the criteria for these 3 authors was that they were winners of a Nobel Prize in Literature. And Gabriela Mistral was the first Latin American to win this prize. So that's quite remarkable. And she was also a woman. Pablo Neruda won the prize in 1971. And Octavio Paz won the prize in 1990. So these Latin American writers reached the world stage through this prize, but they were very well known in Latin America. So you wonder what the context was So these writers wrote during a period of political, historical turmoil. There was a Spanish Civil War, 1936 to 1939, the two world wars, and there were plenty of dictators, Francisco Franco in Spain and Augusto Pinochet in Chile. So how did this impact our writers? Well, they became advocates in ways. They became politicized. Mistral went more on a personal level. She became the voice for the defenseless, like for the children, for poor, women, indigenous people. Pablo Neruda was a highly political person. He ran for president. He postulated for candidacy of Chile, but he didn't actually run. But he also spoke out criticizing the president at that time, who was Videla, in support of striking Chilean workers. And then Paz, finally, he spoke out dramatically and forcefully against the Mexican government when there was a terrible massacre in 1968 of the students. So we're going to start with the two poets, and they are from Chile. And Chile is a remarkable country. Look at it. It is considered the longest country in the world. It is over 2,000 miles long and 177 miles wide. So it's a long, skinny country. And it is also known as the land of the poets, or El País de los Poetas. And we can see that today because we'll be talking about two of those poets, Gabriela Mistral and Pablo Neruda. Both of them were born in tiny little villages. Gabriela Mistral was born in the northern Andes in a tiny town called Vicuña, and Pablo Neruda was born just north of Santiago, the capital of Chile, in a rural area in the central part of Chile called Temuco. Let's dig right in to the first poet. Her real name is Lucila Godoy Alcayaga, but she adopted the pen name of Gabriela Mistral. So you might ask yourself, why did she adopt a pen name? Well, it's kind of interesting. Her first profession was a teacher. And when she was writing her poetry, her colleagues criticized her for the pantheistic, non-Christian, that's the way they interpreted her poetry. And so she realized that she was going to have to camouflage a little bit. So she adopted the name Gabriela Mistral. Gabriela supposedly has to do with the archangel Gabriel, and Mistral is a wind in France. So she's a lover of nature. Her first work was the Sonnets of Death, published in 1914, Los Sonetos de la Muerte. And this catapulted her to the national stage here in Chile at that time, because she won a prize. She won the first prize in this competition called Juegos Florales. And unfortunately, fortunately for us, it was inspired by a trauma. She had a lover, when she was a young woman, she had a lover who committed suicide. And that inspired her to write about death, but also about loss of love and yearning. Her next publication was called Desolación, Desolation. And this has an interesting backstory as well. First of all, she talks about it's a group of a collection of 80 poems organized by different themes, like vida, which means life, escuela, which means school, and different themes that she organized her poems around them. And in there, it's really evident she writes from the heart. She writes about life, death, her profession, teaching, religion, because she was a profoundly religious woman, motherhood, even though she wasn't a mother, and all sorts of poetic inspirations for her, which were things like the natural world. The voice in this, or the way that these poems have been described by critics is haunting and with a maternal tenderness to it. Her poetry is unadorned and simple, pretty simple to understand. So, and it's highly personal. We'll read some of her poetry in a little bit so you can get an idea as to what she was like. Also, there's another little interesting anecdote about this publication. She traveled to New York to Columbia University and recited these poems from this collection to a group of teachers. And they were, first of all, astonished by the poetry, and then also astonished by the fact that she hadn't published these poems. So they supported her and organized it, and they helped promote this and publish this collection of poems. So Gabriela Mistral is often read as an autobiographical poet. In other words, she talks about many things that are close to her heart. And some of the things that are close to her heart are the abandoned woman, children, lovers who are jealous, a mad poet possessed. But also she talked about Latin America, Chile, her homeland, and all of Latin America by describing its magnificent vistas with a great sense of love and joy. So these are the many poetic voices that you can find in her poetry. Gabriela Mistral enchanted North American writers as well as her contemporaries in Latin America. So a well-known American poet named Langston Hughes decided to, translate some of her poetry. And he published some of her poems. And I'd like to read a translation that it can be found in this collection so that you can get an idea of what her poetry is like. This poem is called Richness. I have a true happiness and a happiness betrayed, the other like a thorn, to that taken from me. I was not betrothed. I have a true happiness and a happiness betrayed. And I am rich in purple and rich in melancholy. How well loved the rose, and what a lover the thorn. Like a double image of fruits that are twins, I have a true happiness and a happiness betrayed. As you can see in here, there's a lot of references to the two sides of the coin of love. Love can bring happiness, but it also can bring pain. Mistral is also known, Gabriela Mistral is also known as an educator, very well known as an educator. She started off as a teacher in the small rural town where she lived, but she also traveled to other towns all throughout Chile. And in fact, there's an interesting anecdote that when she was in the village of Temuco, and as you'll recall, Temuco was where Pablo Neruda was born, a young man, a 19-year-old man, approached her and he asked her, he says, I have these poems. Can you please read them and give me your feedback? And sure enough, Mistral Gabriela did read the poems, gave him some feedback, gave him some readings, and mentored this next great poet. So she was really the consummate educator in my mind, because she helped mentor another great poet. She passed on her passion and the tools of her trade to him. And poor Pablo Neruda apparently didn't have support from his family. They didn't think it was a good idea for him to become a writer. So in addition to Chile, Gabriela Mistral was well known outside of Chile, and specifically in Mexico. The educational Secretary of Education, Jose Vasconcelos, invited her to come to Mexico and help him reform the educational system. And she did, in fact. So she is a beloved figure in Mexico as well. So all this, her experience as a teacher is infused in her poetry. You'll find her talking about schools, education, children. It's all there. Gabriela Mistral, like the other poets and writers that we'll be talking about today, was a diplomat. Apparently this is a tradition, at least at that time, to send Latin Americans to send their poets abroad and represent the country. So Gabriela Mistral was at the League of Nations in Paris. She lived in Italy, Spain, Portugal, and Brazil. In fact, she lived more outside of her home country, Chile, than she did live in Chile. So there's a little bit of yearning in her poetry and her writings for the homeland. So as I mentioned earlier, Gabriela Mistral was the one who was the first Latin American to win the Nobel laureate in literature, and that was in 1945. Her image is on the money in Chile. Here's an image of her. I think it's a 5,000 peso. And at the Nobel ceremony, Gulberg cited her. The reason that they picked her was because she was, they wanted to render homage to the riches of Spanish American literature, especially to its queen, the poet of Desolación. You remember that collection that was organized by the teachers that heard her at Columbia University, who has become the great singer of mercy and motherhood. However, I do have to mention that Gabriela Mistral was not necessarily a popular person with the other poets. Popular in the sense that the poets at that time were experimenting with language, and they were writing about surrealism. And here Gabriela Mistral wrote about children, motherhood, love. And these were things that were really seemed out of touch, maybe for her contemporaries. So briefly, I want to finish up with Gabriela Mistral, who really does not get enough attention in the academic world, but these are more biographical facts, but they influence the way she wrote. Her father abandoned the family when she was a very young girl, when she was 2 years old, but he did come back every now and then. And when you ask her, what did you learn from your father? She says, love of poetry. And then you ask her, what did you learn from your mother? She'd say, a love of family and homeland. And what did you learn from your grandmother? She would say, biblical knowledge. There's often biblical references in her poems. And also love, it finds its way into her poems, as we saw in the sonnets, unfortunately due to trauma when her lover committed suicide. So there's a profound sense of loss of love in those poems. And finally, two final things. Gabriela Mistral was a spiritual woman. She was a Franciscan lay person, but she was also a Buddhist at one time. As I mentioned earlier, she spent more time outside of Chile than she did, more time outside of Chile. And that there's a sort of a nomadic quality to her life and also to her writing. You can see it there where she's longing for her ideal childhood. So we leave Gabriela Mistral and we move on to Pablo Neruda, who also had a pen name. And his pen name is Pablo Neruda, but his real name is quite a mouthful, and I'll say it for you. Eliezer Neftali Reyes y Basualto. So Pablo Neruda is a lot easier and more poetic, perhaps. He won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1971. Since we were talking a little bit about love, and we visited Gabriela Mistral and her poetry, let's look a little bit at the way they treat this theme of love in very general terms. So Gabriela Mistral, as we saw, talked about life, death, and loss of love. Pablo Neruda also talks about these things, but he is more of an explicit poet. And his poetry is very sensuous. He talks about erotic love. They both talk about nature in Chile and Latin America. They're struck by that. Critics have cited their rural upbringing, their having grown up in these tiny towns close to the Andes, is a reason for this love of nature. Both of them expressed a collective voice for Latin America. They spoke for Latin America, and they both talked about common objects: wind, rain, feet, and with Neruda, as we'll see later, onions. Pablo Neruda is considered one of the great ones, as we can see here from this quote from John Leonard. And he is often mentioned when you talk about the Western canon, when you talk about Cervantes, when you talk about Shakespeare. Pablo Neruda's name comes up as well. So he's one of the biggies in the canon, literary canon. Here I've listed a few of his collections of poetry. He has quite a huge corpus of poetry, and we will look at them individually, a little bit individually, so you can get an idea as to why he's so well known. So in addition to being a poet, Pablo Neruda is a personality. He is larger than life. And I've called it personality worship, because not only was Pablo Neruda a poet, but he was also a politician. He represented the Communist Party in the Senate, the Chilean Senate, and almost ran for president. He was a diplomat and a lover of life. So he has captured the imagination of many, many filmmakers. And I thought I'd share with you today, if the technology cooperates, with one of the most recent films about Pablo Neruda, which captures all the different facets of his personality. It's a very wonderful movie, and I suggest, if you have the time, for you to look at this movie called Neruda. So here we go. Oops, excuse me. Bear with me, folks. I'll get to this right away. Don't we love technology? Okay, can you see it? Not yet. Excuse me for a second. I just want to double check and make sure everybody can see this. So I'm going to check in.
We don't see it yet. Want me to
don't?
share it from my end?
Oh, that would be wonderful. Thank
Okay.
you. I appreciate it.
Mm-hmm. Can you see my screen, everyone?
I can.
Han pasado solo 3 años desde el fin de la Segunda Guerra Mundial y aquí está a punto de empezar una persecución fabulosa. ¿Cómo me veo?
Irreconocible.
Con ustedes, el poeta Pablo Neruda.
Puedo escribir los versos más tristes esta noche.
Dicen que Neruda es el comunista más importante del mundo.
Se metía la mano al bolsillo, sacaba un papelito, 10.000 proletarios se quedaban callados para escucarlo, mientras recitaba poesía.
Les poètes organisent l'héroïque résistance contre le fascisme chilien.
Ordenaron tu detención.
Tienes que salir del país ahora.
Aquí entro yo, el sagaz comisario Pelusionó, lleno de vida.
Muy buenas tardes, señor presidente.
¿Conoce usted a Neruda?
No, yo no. Sí, señor.
Atrápelo y humíllelo.
Policía,
¿Dónde está ese comunista de mierda?
¿Quieres que te encuentren?
No, pero yo no me voy a esconder debajo de la cama. Esto tiene que ser una cacería salvaje.
En esta ficción todos giramos alrededor del protagonista. Un principal y un secundario.
¿Qué pasa si lo agarro?
Piensen, porque al gobierno le conviene perseguirlo, pero no le conviene agarrarlo.
Yo lo tengo abrazado.
Los tengo a todo Chile buscándome y nadie me va a pillar.
Bueno, salí, pero te van a matar.
¿Personaje secundario? ¿Yo? No, señor.
¡Pablo!
¿Por qué te voy a agarrar?
Esto va a ser muy impresionante.
Han pasado solo 3 años desde el fin de la Segunda Guerra Mundial y aquí está a punto de empezar.
Thank you so much, Julie. That was wonderful. So let me get back to my screen. Forgive me, folks. As you can tell, this is a brave new world out there, the technology, but it's pretty wonderful. So let me get to the slide where we were talking about Pablo Neruda.
It was worth it to see that trailer.
Oh, it's a great movie. Please, if you have a chance, see it, because it talks about when Pablo Neruda was persecuted. He was a poet fugitive, and it gives you a lot of different facets to his life, work, and his personality. So here we are. Now we're going to talk about, he is most about what Pablo Neruda is most well known for. And he is known for his love poetry, and especially this collection of poems called 20 Poemas de Amor. So it's 20 love poems and a song of despair. And in the clip that we just saw, Pablo Neruda recited a little bit of this poem 20, which is very well known. And I'll read it to you, not in the dramatic way that he would have read it, but I'll read it to you in my own way. So poem 20, and these are just a few lines from the poem. I can write the saddest lines tonight. I loved her, and sometimes she loved me too. I am no longer in love with her, that's certain, but maybe I love her. Love is so short, forgetting is so long. So Pablo Neruda has written some of the most beautiful love poems in the world. And in these poems, in this collection, he celebrates sexuality. And one critic says he's a frank, sensuous spokesperson for love. And in this collection, he talks about love affairs. And I just need to quote another critic's assessment of it. He says, in this collection, Neruda mixes memories of his love affairs with images of the wilderness of his beloved southern Chile. So he mixes the two. It's a poetic voice that is just unforgettable. However, Neruda was more than just a love poet. He was also a political activist, and that political activism comes to life in his collection called Residencia en la Tierra, residence on Earth. And this was published in 3 different tomes in 1933, 1935, and 1947. And the interesting thing about this poetry is that it's like a diary. And in this diary, he's describing the world that surrounds him, and he finds it in chaos. So there's a sense of despair. In fact, one Spanish poet described this particular work as Neruda being closer to death than to philosophy, closer to pain than to insight, closer to blood than to ink. At this time in Neruda's life, he was a member of the Communist Party. He worked in the Senate, and he was advocating for change. So there's a great deal of political urgency to his writings at this time. Finally, another huge body of work is found in his in this publication called Cantto General. And in Cantto General, he advocates for justice in the New World, in other words, in Chile and the rest of Latin America. And this is the point where he speaks to the striking workers in Chile, and he criticizes the president, the Chilean president, Vidal, who at that point issues a warrant for his arrest, and he is chased throughout Chile. And eventually he ends up in Argentina and then also in Paris. So he successfully evades his arrest, and he has a chance to write this Cantto General. In this work, he speaks as a public figure, and he's a witness and victim. And he speaks about conquistadores and martyrs and heroes and the working class people. The interesting thing about this work is that it's like a dual odyssey. We trace the odyssey of Pablo Neruda, the poet, and also the odyssey of Latin America. So it's got the emotional quality of a lyric poem, and also that of an epic poem. The final phase, a poetic phase of Pablo Neruda, he returns to love. And many critics have said this is the best. He's the best at doing this. Love is his thing. And so here we have a couple of some works from this phase, his final phase, where he talks about, he dedicates some sonnets to his wife, love sonnets to his wife. He talks about nature in the form of odes. He talks about birds of Chile. And he moves away from the political messages that we saw that were so strident in the 30s. So I thought I'd read to you a poem. Since I promised you onions, I'm going to read a little bit about onions, because this is part of Neruda's talent. He takes something very simple, an onion, and he makes it sexy. He makes it intriguing. So bear with me. I'm going to read the onion poem for you. And he uses an ode, which an ode is a classical form of poetry, normally dedicated to nationalism, honor, highbrow types of themes. But Neruda takes this and he dedicates it to the ordinary, things like onions, tomatoes, earth. So here we go. Onion. Onion, luminous flask, your beauty formed petal by petal, crystal scales expanded you. And in the secrecy of the dark earth, your belly grew round with dew. Under the earth, the miracle happened. And when your clumsy green stem appeared and your leaves were born like swords in the garden, the earth heaped up her power, showing your naked transparency. And as the remote sea and lifting the breasts of Aphrodite, duplicating the magnolia, so did the earth make you, onion, clear as a planet. And destined to shine, constant constellation, round rows of water upon the table of the poor. You make us cry without hurting us. I have praised everything that exists, but to me, onion, you are more beautiful than a bird of dazzling feathers, heavenly globe, platinum goblet, unmoving dance of the snowy anemone, and the fragrance of the earth lives in your crystalline nature. This is a translation by Stephen Mitchell. So as you can see, he really elevates the humble onion to majestic levels. So by 1971, which is the time that we're at right now, we're following sort of a chronological line. Neruda reached the peak of both his political and literary career. And that was when the Chilean Communist Party nominated him for president, but he withdrew and he allowed the socialist nominee, Salvador Allende, to run, and Salvador Allende, as we know, won the elections. 1971 was also the year that Neruda arrived on the world literary stage and he was awarded the Nobel Prize. But poor health forced the poet to return to Chile, and he died in 1973, which is only a few days after a right-wing coup killed his friend Allende and seized power. Subsequently, Chile lived under the brutal rule of the dictator of Augusto Pinochet for 17 years. So Neruda's death was sort of had an ominous tone to it. We're going to move on to the next writer, who is Octavio Paz. And he won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1990. And one of his great themes is solitude, or this is an essay that he wrote called The Labyrinth of Solitude, published in 1958. And it is an extraordinarily beautiful essay. And since I wrote my dissertation about essays, I really cherish this one because it's written as if it were poetry. So he blends some genres. He writes an essay, which is a kind of an intellectual genre, and he makes it poetic. So what does he do in this essay? He asks a big question. He asks Mexicans, who are we? And he answers that question by saying that the culture, Mexican culture, is an offspring of a tense duality, where we have the conquistador Spanish father who abandoned them being Mexico, and the treacherous Indian mother who turned against her own people, who was La Malinche. So in Paz's words, it's hard to summarize this essay, but in Paz's words, who are we and why are we what we're like? He says, because of the wounds that Mexicans suffered as a result of their dual heritage, the Spanish and the Indian, they have developed a defensive stance, hiding behind masks and taking refuge in a labyrinth of solitude. So Paz is much more than an essayist. He's also a poet. He's a literary critic and a journalist. He is a prolific writer, and his literary criticism is outstanding. I mean, it was the bane of my existence when I was in graduate school. We had to read Octavio Paz's literary essays and literary criticism essays, and they were good. They were fabulous. But here I just wanted to give you an idea on this slide as to all the different things that he wrote. He was a poet as well, but he wrote about anthropology and he has an encyclopedic imagination, if you were to describe it in 2 words. And you might ask yourself, well, first of all, let me give you a little biographical information. He was born in Mexico City in 1914, and his family had to leave Mexico because of his family's political associations. They were associated with the Zapatistas. So they left Mexico City and went to New York and lived there for a little while, and then returned to Mexico City, but in a whole different status. They weren't the prominent family that they were before. So you might ask yourselves, and the reason I bring all that up is, how did Paz obtain this encyclopedic knowledge? Well, he did go to the university in the Universidad de Mexico, and he did study law, but he never completed degrees there. But he did have access to his grandfather's vast library. And his grandfather was also a writer and poet and a political person. So Octavio Paz spent many hours in his grandfather's library and just absorbed all this vast array of knowledge. Pretty impressive. I wanted to briefly touch on Paz's politics. Paz went, excuse me, he fought in the Spanish Civil War in a brigade. And as a result of that experience, he wrote some poetry, which is reflected here in this collection of poems called Bajo tu clara sombra y otros poemas, or A Draft of Shadows. This was published in 1937. But Octavio Paz took up the Spanish Republican cause, and he went across the United States. He went to Berkeley, he went to New York, and he promoted the Republican cause. So he was a leftist that had these ideas that the world should not be oppressed by fascism. Paz was also, like our other two poets, a diplomat, and he spent many years as a diplomat. He started in France as a cultural attaché in 1945 and spent the next 20 years as a diplomat. And interestingly, one of the places that really impacted him as a person and as a writer was when he was in India from 1962 to 68. And you see a lot of the Hindu ideas of duality in his writings. So he too enjoyed the fruits of being a diplomat, like our other two writers. And like the others, he won the Nobel laureate in 1992. Why? Well, the Academy said for his sensuous intelligence and his humanistic integrity. And you can see throughout his writings in that essay, the Labyrinth of Solitude, and his poetry and all his writings, ideas from Marxism, surrealism, existentialism, Buddhism. And if you had to summarize, and it's a hard thing to do with Paz, one of the overall themes is the human ability to overcome existential solitude through erotic love and artistic creativity. So once again, the idea of love comes into view. So I just wanted to briefly tell you again that it's through love that we can find our way out of this labyrinth, or at least the Mexican people, of solitude. If we had to summarize it real quickly, like an elevator summary of this particular essay, he would say the human condition is being alone, and the solution to that is love and creativity. So finally, I want to go back to that question of love. What's love got to do with it? As Tina Turner sang so beautifully about. It's our birthright, I'd say all three of them would say. We're entitled to love. Mistral says that she sees it as a connective tissue, as mothers, as with God. Pablo Neruda was more of a sensuous poet, and he talked about erotic love. But he also expressed, as well as Gabriela Mistral, a love for Latin America and the natural world, as we saw with the onions. And Octavio Paz, as I mentioned just a little bit earlier, he said love was the way out of our existential quandary of solitude. So I wanted to end with another poem, and this time it's from Pablo Neruda. And this one really doesn't have to do with love, but one of the questions that came to my mind is, how did these writers get inspired? What's that urge, that life force that inspires them to write? So I think this small short poem addresses the writing process and how it affects the poet, and in this case, Pablo Neruda. So I'll read this brief poem and end with poetry. And something started in my soul, fever or forgotten wings, and I made my own way, deciphering that fire. And I wrote the first faint line, faint without substance, pure nonsense, pure wisdom of someone who knows nothing. And I suddenly saw the heavens unfastened and open. So with that, I end and invite you to discover these poets, writers on your own, because they're certainly worth reading. I don't know how much time we have for questions, but maybe I can take a couple of questions.
Yes, I'm sure you can. Thank you, Patricia. That was fascinating, just beautiful.
Thank you.
Are there some questions from the audience? Julianne, you have your hand up.
No, I was just clapping.
Okay, yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Julianne.
Sarah, I see you've unmuted. Do you have a comment?
Yeah, I did. May I?
Oh, certainly, Sarah. Welcome.
All right. Well, thank you. Your presentation was wonderful. And for two reasons. One, I'm from Chile.
Oh,
yes. So I had to study both Pablo and Gabriela, or Gabriela and Pablo, when I was in high school. Then I became scientist, so I was away from literature, but I enjoy so much your presentation. And I have here a little postcard of the place where Gabriela was born, which is, yeah, I have been there. It's called Monte Grande, the big mountain. It's, okay, I don't know if it can be seen.
Oh, it's beautiful.
There is a church.
Yes.
And her house and museum is there. And then the mountains, you see, she lived between mountains. I mean, it's amazing. It's a valley. And oh my God, if you ever go there, go to the city is called La Serena. It's a beautiful Spanish city. And then the valley to the mountains is called Elqui, Indian name, valley. And Monte Grande, where she was born, is at the very end near the mountains. There is where she had the first experience as a teacher. So, and I think that solitude and that soledad came from, because I'm also from the north, even farther north from her place, yes. Near the Atacama Desert. So I know what the sky is about and all that wonderful geography we have. And Pablo is from the south. So Pablo is a different, person, different poet. But thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. You let my two poets known here.
Oh, thank you, Sara. First of all, I want to thank you for sharing that image, because it's on my bucket list to go to Monte Grande, right? That's where she was born.
Yes, yes.
And that Elqui Valley and those Andes Mountains. I mean, it's something that's just, I've never been to Chile. I've been to Peru, but I've never been to Chile, and it's in my heart. I want to
get my email and I'll be your guide, because I have an apartment in La Serena.
Oh, so, thank you, Sara.
So when the pandemic is over, I'm going to go back.
Of course.
I think we've made a match here.
Thank you so much, Sara.
I know that a number of tourists also go to Pablo Neruda's home in Santiago. It sounds like Ophelia is ready to tell us about that. Is that right, Ophelia? Unmute yourself, Ophelia. Ophelia, you're mute. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you again for this wonderful, wonderful presentation. It's just marvelous. But I did want to share this point, because I was only able to go to Chile once and for a couple of days. And I noticed there was a tour they offer a tour of Pablo Neruda's homes. So I signed up for this tour. And they took us to 3 of his homes, but I only remember 2 of them. The one in the city that you mentioned, and then there's a one, I think, in the Isla Negra, no? Yeah. And that was spectacular. The home is built like a ship. And so, yeah, so you go from room to room, and it's like as if, you know, he built it right next to the ocean, to the Pacific Ocean or so. And it is just overwhelming to be there and seeing. And so it reminded me when the very front part of your presentation was a picture of Pablo Neruda with the sea behind him.
Oh, yeah.
He loved the sea, and he built his homes like boats and he like ship, and it was just incredible. So I just wanted to add that.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. These are places I want to go. And thank you for sharing that. The ship, I didn't know that about his architecture, that's what he lived. Yeah.
Pardon me, I have a question here in our Oak Room. This is one of our Okemic residents.
I would love to have you read a short poem from one of those authors in Spanish.
Oh, how wonderful.
And because I would like to hear the rhythm of the poem without the translation.
Oh, that is such a good idea. May I do that?
Yes.
Wonderful.
Okay. So, you know, I picked the final poem was from Pablo Neruda, and it's from Isla Memorias de Isla Negra. And I'll just read, I read the English translation, so I'll just read it in Spanish. How about that? It's not too long.
Wonderful.
Okay, here we go. And I hope you'll have to forgive me, Sara. I know you probably could read this just as beautifully. So anyway, here we go. Y algo golpeaba en mi alma, fiebre o alas perdidas, y me fui haciendo solo, descifrando aquella quemadura, y escribí la primera línea vaga, vaga sin cuerpo, pura tontería, pura sabiduría, del que no sabe nada, y vi de pronto el cielo desgranado y abierto. So in that, he's talking about how all of a sudden he wrote something and it was just nonsense. And then at the end, it turns out to be something where the whole heavens unleash this incredible creativity. So thank you for that. Thank you for letting me read it in Spanish.
Yes.
It was a great idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, may I say something about Pablo? When we were at high school, we were kids, you know, so compared to Gabriela, we didn't like the monotony of his voice because he was very monotonous. So the Ode to the Onion, oh my God, you know, it was like we went to sleep sometimes. We were kids. We couldn't appreciate the beauty of his writing because he was very you know, that was his personality.
Yeah.
It was incredible.
That's a good point, because I was going to include one of him reading a poem, and Poema 20, the 20, and it's incredible. He just speaks in this monotone voice, and you're wondering why do you do that? I don't know.
We never knew. I am from the very north of Chile, and sometimes people are from the south where it rains a lot. They have different kind of personality, you know. They are more there. I mean, we don't know why he was like that, because he was from a place where it rains months. So you have to be indoors a lot. Anyway, so that was Pablo Neruda, and then he became very political and etc. So people wanted him to be a candidate to be president. So he didn't want to do that. He was happy with the Nobel Prize. So yes. So, oh, by the way, please, whoever haven't seen the Il Postino, the postman, please see it, because first of all, it's part of Italy, in the island there when he was away from Chile. And it's a nice story. It's very nice. It's very sweet, and it's a wonderful story.
Oh yeah,
Il Postino. I saw it here at the Hippodrome in Gainesville, Florida, and it must be somewhere that people can watch.
Yeah, if I had been a little more clever, I would have done that clip from Il Postino too, but I was a little afraid of the technology. So
it's fine.
But that's a very beautiful movie.
Oh, it's
Very
beautiful. I mean, and the actor, you know, that he went up in that road to deliver the letters to him. And you know what happened to that actor?
No.
He had a heart attack after a few days after filming and died.
Oh, that's too bad.
The Italian actor, yes. And people thought, well, maybe he went too much on the bicycle, you know, to go on filming. We don't know. But anyway, I'm not going to take more time.
Thank you, Sara. Thank you. Gracias.
It's a wonderful presentation. I think we're looking forward to next week. Any final comments, Margaret or Patricia?
No, just eager for next week from me. How about you, Patricia?
Oh, I'm excited. I just don't know how I'm going to tackle all these great superstars. It's like, how do I get it across to you that it's worth the time to read them? But I'll figure it out. Don't worry.
Today was great. So do what you did again.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
See you next week.
Bye-bye.